More on these cultural missteps, I'm joined by Mark Greiz, marketing strategist at Mark Greiz Consulting, a fashion, hospitality and lifestyle consultancy. He's also an adjunct professor at the Fashion Institute of Technology. So let's start with your take on D&G's campaign in China and the reactions that we saw from Chinese consumers.
Well, you just had a very interesting segment, and usually in any situation, when you create an ad in one culture and then you actually place that ad in another culture, there could always be certain misunderstandings, especially when it comes to things like humor. Humor is something which is very hard to interpret from one culture to another culture. So just from a very, very broad perspective, there are issues when it comes to creating ads, especially from Western cultures and then interpreting them into Chinese culture. But again, regarding Dolce & Gabbana, this is not their first misstep in the Chinese market. Last year, I think we all remember, they did a campaign on Weibo as well, and they portrayed Beijing in a very poor light. And they actually had to apologize for that as well and also create a new video to portray Beijing in a better light as well. So I think there's a lot of issues for Dolce & Gabbana with this campaign, but also generally their portrayal of China within their particular marketing campaigns.
So if you see this pattern forming then, what is this costing D&G, not just in terms of reputation, but also potentially its bottom line?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, no one can predict the future. I myself feel that in the short term, they will definitely be impacted by their particular mishap in this campaign. Not so much by the ad itself, because all ads can be interpreted in many different ways, but primarily from the actual private conversations that Stefano had on his Instagram account with somebody else. But honestly, I do feel that given some time and if certain steps are taken, I feel that eventually Dolce & Gabbana can retake and rebuild their position in the China market, but there has to be some actions on their behalf to do it.
And it's certainly not just limited to Dolce & Gabbana. In fact, earlier this year, Chinese detergent brand Xiaobi found itself facing its own backlash when it had a widely deemed racist ad for how it portrayed the black character being put in a washing machine and coming out as a different race. So what are some other examples of companies and brands being culturally insensitive?
Well, honestly, this goes back for years and years. I mean, if we go back about 5 to 7 years, Dior, another luxury brand, created a print advertisement in China, which portrayed a very elegant white lady dressed in a Dior couture gown standing next to a bunch of drab-looking Chinese people. Nike in 2004, 2005 had a Chamber of Fear commercial with LeBron James, where he was beating down elements of Chinese culture like dragons, kung fu masters, etc. So this has been going on for a long time. Dior, as I mentioned, and Dolce Gabbana as well had previous issues in the China market. And likewise, Carrefour. I think you may remember back in the Beijing Olympics in 2008, they had a stance to support Tibet independence during the Beijing Olympics, and there was mass protests. I was in Beijing during that time. Consumers wanted to boycott Carrefour. But again, that was short-lasted, and then soon later, people were shopping at Carrefour again.
Now, at a certain point, though, I mean, we're in 2018, we're in the information age, companies have access to focus groups. How do these marketing failures keep on happening?
That is actually a very important topic, and I always recommend pre-testing ads with focus groups. But oftentimes, a lot of these fashion brands, especially luxury brands, are considered very ethnocentric. I mean, they're very based on the creator and the creative directors, and they tend to look introspectively. They tend to, again, be very ethnocentric and create ads which feel that will appeal to them instead of appealing to the target market. So I think that's a big problem. And unfortunately, as you mentioned, we're in 2018. Bad news and good news both travel very fast through social media. So I do feel brands really do need to be much more aware, whether it's a simple thing as a tweet or whether it's a major ad campaign in a magazine or TV or online. Advertising should be tested before, because it definitely can be a lot of cultural blunders, and they will continue. There will continue to be cultural blunders all over the world, including China.
Now let's look towards solutions then. What steps should brands take to avoid these marketing failures? So, like when you think of the inception of some of these big branding ideas, walk us through how to avoid this.
Well, personally, I feel that one of the things that you should avoid, especially in China, because every market's a little bit different, try to avoid humor, because humor gets, even within America and, for example, a culture like the UK, where we both have English as our native language. American humor and British humor is very different. It can often be misunderstood. So can you imagine Western humor compared to Chinese humor? So I would say stay away from humor, and also stay away from a lot of cultural references, Chinese cultural references, because I think it's very hard for Western brands to understand Chinese cultural references. Focus on the brand, focus on the product, focus on the imagery. And I think if you stay away from some of the cultural references, you stay away from some of the humor, I think a lot of brands will really, their campaigns will be much more successful in the market.
And we've certainly seen these companies apologize, but what about actually giving the people who are involved in this, if, for example, if you want Chinese consumers, why not have more Chinese people at the table when these decisions are being made?
That's a very good decision. And actually, my recommendation for D&G really going forward, as you mentioned before in your segment, a lot of the local consumers, Chinese consumers, are feeling that Stefano's apology and D&G's apology wasn't that sincere. I feel back a few years ago, just to give a little history, Dolce Gabbana made a statement that they would never have a Japanese creative director as a creative director in their brand. That caused a lot of backlash in Japan, saying they were racist as well, although I don't really think it was racist. I think they want to preserve their Italian heritage. But I think if D&G really wants to be serious about the China market, maybe they should consider having, maybe not Chinese, but an Asian creative director or a junior creative director for the brand, and get them involved, get Asians or actually Chinese designers and creative people more involved in the brand at a grassroots level. I think they'll do a lot to appease the Chinese market and also the general Asian market as a whole.
All right, thank you so much for your insights.